again, everyone. I'm Gail Brenner and the moderator of our panel this afternoon. And the title of our panel is How Psychotherapy Can Support the Realization of Our True Nature. And I'm going to begin by introducing our esteemed panel, starting with John Prendergast. Well, maybe they're new people.
Okay.
Who is the author of the forthcoming book entitled In Touch, that will be published next spring by Sounds True. He is a retired professor at CIIS and a psychotherapist in private practice. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of Undivided, the online journal of Nonduality and Psychology, as well as the senior editor of The Sacred Mirror and Listening from the Heart of Silence. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Ellen Emmet is a therapist with a background in somatic movement and transpersonal psychology, which is now integrated with her non-dual understanding. She also facilitates deep explorations of the body in group sessions in the tradition of Jean Klein, Francis Lucille, and Kashmir Shaivism. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you.
And Karen Johnson is the co-founder of the Diamond Approach with Hamid Ali. She has an MA in psychology, but does not practice as a therapist. And she uses her knowledge of the psyche to move through barriers to the underlying truth. Welcome, Karen. And again, I'm Gail Brenner. I'm a psychologist and author of the forthcoming book called The End of Self-Help. And I'm most interested in living the non-dual understanding in the humanity of everyday life. So, because not everyone on our panel is a psychotherapist, Karen identifies herself as a spiritual teacher, I'm going to avoid using the word psychotherapy, but what we are talking about are what we normally call psychotherapy, which are ongoing one-on-one sessions with a therapist or spiritual teacher to address psychological suffering. So that's going to be the starting point of our conversation today. So my first question, the core understanding of non-duality is that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are consciousness itself and not the separate, limited self defined by beliefs, habits, stories, and identification. Is there a value for truth seekers to participate in these ongoing sessions to support the realization of their true nature? So is there a value for truth seekers to participate in sessions with a psychologist, counselor, spiritual teacher to support the realization of their true nature? And if so, what is the value of these kinds of sessions?
Well, I would say absolutely yes. No surprise, because that's what I do. And I love it, and it has a beautiful, rich, transformative value. So mainly I work with people who are interested in waking up. And they're somewhere along that spectrum of awakening, and they find it extremely helpful to have some support and guidance in that process. It's very difficult to see our own blind spots, to see where it is that we're stuck in terms of a fixation of identification, fixation of attention and identification. So if someone who's interested in the awakening process sits with someone else who's sitting in presence and has both a clarity of understanding and a felt sense of what that feels like, that's a really helpful catalyst and mirror for the support of that unfolding. And I can say a lot more about the details of that.
I agree. If I had found a therapist when I was before I met my teacher, I was in great need of something, and I was in therapy, but unfortunately my therapists were not established or even awakened to their true nature. And now in retrospect, I would have loved to have met a therapist like you, and I think it is a great resource, not for everybody necessarily, but for those who seek it, who feel that they might need that, it's a great resource. It's an extra help beyond satsang. It's just a kind of, you could say it's a kind of intimate satsang, a place where you can expose certain things that you might not feel comfortable exposing in the group format of a spiritual meeting with a teacher. And so for many reasons, and this is just a few reasons, yes, it's a very, very good idea.
I think if we're actually interested in living a life where our realization is expressing itself, it's necessary. It's not just a good thing, but it's, I think we're becoming more and more aware, which is why the questions are even being asked, is how do these two things relate to one another? And I think we can see that many of you probably had experiences of deep realization, and then there's a snapping back into all kinds of reactivity and difficulties that realization can even exaggerate, not just bring out and go, oh, there's that pattern again. No, it puts a pressure on our usual patterns to be exposed. So I think psychotherapy is a really important part. For my work, I work with patterns as part of the realization process, much the way John was talking about, of discovering where you are now, working with the pattern as it is and moving through it to a deeper level, and not just stopping at reaching a new homeostasis. So I would say in a situation where one is practicing a path that doesn't involve looking at the psychology, that it's a good adjunct. But at the same time, you can also see it as part of spiritual work and not separate from it.
I had a comment here just to kind of elaborate a little bit on a point you made, Ellen, which is that of confidentiality. Actually, it's interesting. People can go to satsangs, spiritual gatherings and retreats, and get a great deal out of them. I certainly have over the years. And yet there are often kind of individual issues that people don't feel comfortable. They either don't feel it's spiritual enough, or they don't feel safe in bringing it up in a group. And in a more confidential and contained environment, these can come out and where they won't anywhere else. I mean, and this is the beauty, actually, of having, that's just the container itself, but the presence of the therapist also is that container,
the relationship,
isn't it? The relationship.
Because in a therapeutic setting, it's a very particular kind of relationship. It's very, it happens over time, sometimes many years, and so it can take many faces. It can be a kind of parent-child relationship. It can be a teacher-student relationship. It can be just a sharing. It can take all the faces that might need to arise.
And sometimes it's the most intimate relationship anybody ever has.
That's true, yeah.
That they can say things to their therapist or their teacher that they can't really say to anybody else. So the vulnerability is so pronounced and profound.
I'd like to add another perspective, and I do this kind of work as well, but in my own history, I had about at least 15 years of psychotherapy, and as I look back, it did just about nothing. The shadow is a term coined by Carl Jung, which refers to our undesirable emotions and hidden secrets that we have turned away from, disowned, or rejected in ourselves, which leaves them outside of conscious awareness. So we may avoid these emotions because we think they're too painful to experience, or we judge them as wrong or shameful. So the question here is, do these shadow experiences need to come to awareness for awakening to our true nature? Can you explain your answer? Is that necessary?
Yep.
Yep.
Please say more.
Because if they don't, there's going to be a part of our nature that can't express itself, that we won't be able to. I mean, you can look at it in many different ways. The way I look at it is that as an individual consciousness, we're both the spirit and the psychology of ourselves. We can't, that's why the two sides have a point. It's the spiritual side and the psychological are the continuum of what we are. And when our consciousness is patterned in such a way that we have the unconscious and the conscious as separate, we're going to be segmented, and we're going to be cut off, and we're going to be forgetting our nature. So in the places where there's the shadows, we've forgotten, and it's forgotten to the point of not even knowing we've forgotten. And that's why another person sitting with you in relationship can help to bring those things out. And most often, they're very primitive kinds of feelings. Jealousy can go all the way to hatred and anger and all of these kind of very unspiritual things, like you were saying, John, that we get in touch with and we think, well, no, I'm pure awareness, I'm pure consciousness, no, that's not okay. That's not openness, that's not lovingness, because when we are the vastness, we feel that openness, we feel caretaking of all, but these things block that, and they will continue to do so. And we'll act out on them and not know it. It'll come out in ways that we don't expect or that other people don't.
I feel like I want to formulate something. I agree with that, and I find that I used to be very attracted to the Jungian formulations, and then over these past few years, I don't really feel that draw anymore, so I don't necessarily think of in terms of shadow or archetypal, unconscious, but I do feel that, therapy provides a space for layers of feelings and beliefs and sensations to surface that are under the surface and are kind of really the abode of the separate entity. That's where separation operates. So the surfacing of that can take many forms, and there are archetypes. I mean, we have kind of a living repertoire as human beings, so there are certain kinds of feelings that seem to surface in the form of energy and emotions, and I find that very beautiful. I find it very, I don't feel any need, even from a non-dual perspective, to kind of cleanse the shapes that arise, because they feel like they have, I don't know, they just feel they're authentic, and if you meet them and follow them, and cooperate with the healing that is a kind of natural movement of energy, if you as a therapist are kind of representing presence, then everything moves back to presence. Everything wants to move back to presence. So, yes. So I don't know if I'm answering a question.
I would agree. It's like everything wants to be liberated, right? Everything wants to be touched with love and understanding eventually. What's kind of interesting is that I think it is possible to have dramatic and initial awakenings without having done much in the way of working on shadow material. In other words, sometimes we think all the shadows have to be cleared in order to, kind of discover our true nature, and that's clearly not the case, because conditioning is, I think, always going to be there more or less anyway. But it's interesting because there are a lot of spiritual seekers, and I was one of them, who really could cultivate certain states, expansive states, without really being in touch with my feelings. And I think, where we see this kind of acting out that you're talking about, Karen, is with teachers, who have some illumined awareness, and yet it's only partial, it's incomplete. And then the shadow elements get acted out in the classic ways, right? Sex, money, and power, right? And we see that again and again and again. So that's a clue, isn't it? Right? That there's something to attend to. But how it happens, the order of that is really quite mysterious. But I think eventually, whatever is in the shadows is going to be welcomed, in the light. And all the shadows bear gifts. This is the beauty that I find in exploring, not getting attached to the shadows, letting them be as they are, but giving them space to move, giving them space to reveal themselves. And there's a gift, in every difficult experience that we have. So, for instance, if we're experiencing terror, if we learn to tolerate it and open to it, we find our deep ground, a deep stability and solidity. Right? If we open to our grief, we find our joy. If we explore our powerlessness, we find some essential quality of power there. So it's actually a beautiful process, although it can be challenging, and difficult, and take time also. So it takes courage, I think.
So I want to ask you more specifically along these lines. What happens? How do you welcome these elements, these experiences that are outside of conscious awareness? Like, what does that work look like when you're working with someone?
I'm blunt.
I'm sorry?
I can be very blunt.
Blunt?
What I tend to do is when I'm working with someone, I'll watch a pattern develop over time. And I do different kinds of techniques that bring out different things. And so I don't always say what I'm seeing or say what's happening, but if there's a pattern that develops over time in relationship to me, I'll point to it and let them know, when that happens, I notice my reaction is such and such. Sometimes I'll say it like that. You're acting angry. Are you aware of that? And that it happens every time I ask you this particular kind of question or we do this particular thing. Sometimes they're aware of it and sometimes they're not. Or they'll come in with a similar pattern with their husband or their girlfriend and they'll constantly blame them and not see that they're acting in a very attacking and angry way. And these are people who are really wanting to be engaged in a spiritual journey. That's what they're coming to me for, but they're describing something in their experience and not aware at all that this is happening. So I might just come out and say it if they don't, or I'll turn it back on them and say, well, how do you feel when you're telling me this? Well, I just feel really agitated, okay, and I'll go into that, and that might bring out the anger. But if somebody is so against the anger, I might at some point just say, you sound really angry. And so it depends on where somebody is and how that might look. Or I sometimes do body work and I'll have them breathe in a certain way that is aggressive to see if they can get in touch with and get conscious of the aggression. So it might look lots of different ways. I'm kind of fluid about it. But if somebody is completely defended against it and is acting it out all the time, I'll come out and tell them after watching it for a long time and say, my experience of you is that you're acting very angry, but you don't seem to be aware of it. What's happening? Or am I misreading it? What's going on? And point to it, and actually, at some point, I'll find I need to do that. So that helps direct their attention, bring their awareness to a place they might not have. I tend to call it a blind spot. Shadow to me is a little elusive. So I think what you're speaking of, for me, would be called a blind spot, something that is really obvious to many people and not at all obvious to others. It may not be obvious to others either unless you get really down deep into the psyche.
Well, I'm speaking about that, and also like emotions, for example, that might be outside of conscious awareness, like someone driven by fear when they don't realize there's fear there. That may or may not be seen by other people, but that's an unexplored area within.
Right, so that could be a blind spot.
Yeah,
too.
blind spot.
But I find that well, when the question is posed about techniques, I immediately go, no, I just don't do techniques. It seems that I don't do techniques, but I'm a kind of, I don't like form, I think, as a character. So I was very happy when I kind of realized that as a therapist, I didn't need a form. I didn't need a technique. I really just needed to take my stand as openness, and that the technique would arise if necessary. So that was really nice for me. I mean, for others, it probably didn't change anything, but for me it was, yes. You know, if they're very involved with the story, you know, when they first come in, that story needs to be heard, and there's not much of a technique then. There's just a listening warmth and maybe not uninvolved, but a welcoming, and which then maybe allows the emotion that's just underneath the surface or embedded in the story to surface. And then again, you know, maybe more listening, not much. And then maybe a little bit of nudging towards the body. But again, I tend to hope that happens effortlessly. The more effortless, the better in my case. The less work, the better. But then, you know, with the body, there's many things that one finds oneself doing with a client, simply by posing questions or pointing to the space that a sensation is experienced in, and that space is safe, for example, and open. I mean, I think that maybe you could reduce the overarching technique is a sense of safety and love, and that a lot can unfold in just that.
With them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, that's another thing I was thinking as you were talking. I was feeling your sensitivity and openness, and it's touching. And the other thing that in my work that happens is that a certain quality will arise of presence that will respond to really where someone is. So it's not really guesswork or trying to fish it out. It's actually something that shows up, and that can be strength or kindness or brilliance or something that's actually a presence that's doing the work, that's bringing out the resonance with somebody and kind of reaching into them and ushering it out. So it doesn't actually, it feels like that's what's enabling the technique to come through. Comes through the presence that's there. That's what's animating my expression and brings that forward. And that has more power, I think, than a technique per se, that it actually is responding to something, and that's got an entanglement element to it, in that it resonates with something over there. And then there's a meeting in some way.
It's interesting. I agree with that. I don't think we're going to disagree too much, are we?
What?
As a panel.
I didn't hear.
We're not going to disagree too much as a panel. It sounds like we're in accord, and I'm certainly in accord. I mean, there are plenty of formal uncovering techniques. We can, breathe a certain way, and we can sense a certain way, do postures or whatever. So, yeah, it's nice to be free of any agenda, and any particular methodology. What came up for me as you asked that, Gail, was though it's like what's shadowed or what's unconscious or what's wanting to be brought into awareness. Very often we feel it in the body, as a kind of contraction. And so, not everyone's able to sense the body and get a sense of that, but if they do, it's like, areas of holding and tightness and resistance and contraction. These are usually, related in some way to that which is wanting to be liberated. And it is true that, again, it's the power of presence. If we're really resting in that awareness and receiving the other intimately, it has a kind of natural catalytic and transformative influence. Now, sometimes I fall into a quiet gazing with my clients and those that I mentor spiritually, not for long periods of time. It's just like there are moments that just get quiet and there's nothing to say. And there's these gaps, these beautiful moments of just being together, where the story drops away, the persona softens, and that sense, any hardened sense of self and other begins to dissolve. And these are very beautiful moments because they're so intimate. This is the relational piece, right? And what comes up in that intimacy, is very interesting. right? Because like, ooh, you see me, right? We feel exposed, we feel vulnerable, right? And there's something there that's, wanting to be touched. So it can show up too in our core beliefs. And, you can track those. I have an ear, somehow I've developed an ear for core beliefs, so I'm listening to my clients and I can, okay, not enough, flawed, right? And that's often a kind of inroad, into these areas that have been repressed or diminished.
What strikes me listening to the conversation here is how different this is from how I was trained as a traditional therapist. And I wondered if you could speak to that. I mean, I never learned about presence, and I learned a little bit about the development of the relationship and everything, but the depth that's being offered here is I think uncommon in therapy. And I wondered if you could comment on that and what you see that you each bring to this arena as opposed to someone without this understanding of their true nature.
Well, I can say a little about that.
I can say a lot about that.
Yeah, I could.
Obviously.
I could say a lot about it. I won't.
Retired professor.
I'll just say a little bit about it. I was fortunate to actually be trained in a more alternative program, the California Institute of Asian Studies, before it became Integral Studies. And so I had a transpersonal and kind of existential and experiential orientation. So there was an emphasis on actually being present with immediate experience. And but what's interesting is my interest in non-dual understanding and practice actually felt like almost like a separate track. It's like I was doing both. I was sitting with clients and working in a more transpersonal way. I wasn't quite sure what that was. And meanwhile, kind of unraveling, who I took myself to be. This is with Jean Klein in the 1980s, for instance. And then interestingly, some point, I could not distinguish between psychology and spirituality, in what I was doing. Something shifted internally. That's why, and the sense of presence was just coming into the foreground quite spontaneously. So, and I really, that wasn't through my training. That wasn't through my academic training or my supervision. That was really through the time spent with my teachers and my own practice of inquiry. So I'm, eternally grateful, for that. And so I became a professor, and I began teaching students, right, about presence, and about getting out of the story and being open and unfurnished, and they loved it. I just retired a couple of years ago from teaching, but I must say there's a tremendous hunger in the field by younger therapists and a growing, I would say, understanding of this as well. That, they would tell me, and I feel a little shy to say this, but they would say, this was my favorite class. This is what I came to this school for. No one else is teaching this, and this is what I most want.
But to be honest, even in transpersonal psychology departments, they don't teach this.
No.
I mean, I think you're
That's
a rare.
Yeah.
Because I got my master's at JFK, and I shouldn't say. Scratch. Anyway, it's too late. But I remember Francis Lucille saying, just get the degree, get the paper, put it on your wall, and do whatever you want. And it's true. I mean, I find I can't even remember what I learned in university. I do remember some things, of course I do, but they've been infused by my non-dual understanding, and that's what brings them to life. But when I was in the classroom, I was bored most of my time. It's terrible. And it was expensive.
It was
I got into lots of interesting debates.
I'm sure you did.
And some of them appreciated it and some of them didn't. But I think one of the things that I would want to underscore for anyone who is studying psychology, actually, and people interested in spirituality, is that it's a continuum, that there isn't a separation. Like you were saying, how can you separate those two parts of yourself? It's a matter of how you're holding it. If there's the psychological and the spiritual, then there's always going to be some way that those have to be balanced and seen as different. If you go deep into the psyche, you arrive at your nature. You go deep into any part of you, and go deep enough into your mind, you arrive at your nature. Go deep enough into your body, you arrive at your nature. It's your nature. How can it be anything else? So using the psychological techniques, I think, are useful, but not as an end in themselves, and not as a way, for me, of balancing and making somebody happy. You can get someone to a new status quo where they feel like, okay, things are now fine. But they're not fine because that's a house of cards. And that's going to collapse, and then there's going to be more issues, and then you reestablish the status quo again. To really have the happiness that people seek in psychotherapy, you have to be in touch with something deeper. And that's when someone says they've gotten something really out of their psychotherapy, they talk about something they felt deeper. They talk about being in touch with their feelings when they weren't. That's a depth. They talk about getting to something else that's beyond their feelings that they didn't know existed, and they might not even have a word for it. That's a new depth. But they don't conceptualize it that way, but when psychotherapy's working, it deepens something. Unless somebody's really in a condition where they're broken. And what I mean is they never had a self, and they need to have one. They need to have that stability of being in the world, being an object, being a coherent self, and that needs a therapist who can help build it, help stabilize it, and then there may be the process of destabilizing it and coming into the depth. So I think being able to build structure is a skill that's extremely unusual, but very necessary. But for those who have a structure and say, I'm unhappy and unsatisfied, that's because they don't know who they are and they don't know what they are. And then you can't just keep putting shutters in different ways. The light has to come in somewhere.
And what's amazing is the light is there. It's always there, available to be recognized with grace or the proper direction. It's
if you know where to look.
If you know where to look, yes, absolutely.
Where to look and how to look.
Yes.
And how, and then.
Which brings me to another question, which is, I know you mentioned the body, working with the body and the physical realm, and I know for all of us, it's part of how we work with people. And I'm wondering if you could say more about what is the importance of working in the physical realm in this kind of, to support people in knowing who they are.
It's very important because it's half of our experience is the body, and so half of the ways by which we perpetuate suffering is going to be at that more irrational level. So it's very important. It's only half the job if you deal with the beliefs at the level of the mind. I know you agree with this.
From my point of view, the body is the outermost expression of our individual consciousness, and its patterning is the language, and the ways those patterns come out is basically the way the history is still in there. We're still stuck in the past, and that stuckness arises in our consciousness as tension. And as we open those tensions up, the stories come with it, the feelings come with it. It's like we untrap our consciousness. And it tells the story, and that's the first part. It goes through the pain, and then that openness can arise, and the body can become more transparent to its nature. So that's part of living a human life, is having a body that works according to natural law.
And what's interesting is, what is the body, really? Because we're speaking of the physical body right now. It's like, is it just this solid, apparent object? When we actually begin to to check in, to drop in with our attention, the quality of the body changes, right? It's not so solid.
Right.
It's not so dense. There are subtler levels that open up, what we might call the energy body. And I think the energy body aspect of the transformational process is really key. It's really an important piece. So yes, the physical body is an outpicturing of the patterns and the stresses, and so too the energy body, which is very sensitive. So as the energy body wakes up, we actually feel, energy beyond the body. It's like our sense of the body begins to expand, and it deepens as well. These very fine layers open up of sensitivity. And I find working with people, mainly I'm just tracking aliveness, right? The sense of essential aliveness or its refusal. And that's felt in a very energetic way. I just happen to be sensitive that way. So if I sit with someone and they're open and they're interested in exploring their experience, I feel it. I feel it in my body. I feel the emotions. I feel the areas of contraction. I feel the energy that's wanting to open and release. And it's like it's wanting, there's this deep impulse to self-regulation that we all have, to a movement towards our not only essential nature, but our essential health. And in the right environment, that will really start opening and blossoming as well. So the body is actually not what we think it is. It's fascinating. Actually, at some point, the body opens up, and we feel ourselves not just in the body, right? The body is in us, and it's all our body, in a way.
Our consciousness has a body.
Yeah, the body of consciousness we could speak of as well. So there are dimensions here, subtle but very important dimensions that open up in presence, I would say. It's like the body too wants to be liberated.
It's consciousness.
It wants to shine,
It wants to be relieved of this kind of impossible task of being the cage for consciousness, which, it's this absurd mission.
It's an interesting point,
Makes
too,
me
because
feel
Karen...
all fizzy.
Sorry?
Makes me feel all fizzy.
Yeah. Ooh. It frees the life current.
Yeah.
A lot of life energy.
And it makes me think of working with people who have been abused, maybe in childhood. And it's been my experience of quite a few times with clients that there's been an abuse, physical abuse, at a young age, and at the same time as the abuse, there was an out-of-body experience that was accompanied by a spiritual glimpse. So that later in life, there's a great deal of confusion. There's confusion, a felt confusion, and a fear of opening to the spiritual curiosity that might be there, because it's completely married with that trauma. So that there's a lot there, a lot of disentangling, and really pointing to the fact that the body is, as you said, John, just sensation and energy, and it doesn't appear in a void. It appears in openness, and that can be experienced as a kind of, as that is our true nature, but we can begin to really feel that somehow and open to that experience, and then there's just layers get freed up, and that's the definition of healing. That's healing. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant by becoming more transparent, because with the tensions, we are opaque. We feel the opacity.
Yes.
And as we were opening up, as I was listening to you, I just felt more and more fizzy as you were talking.
It's interesting because you were saying, I think in your talk,
It's
Karen...
so exciting.
Sorry? You're excited?
I'm so excited. I am just talking, the aliveness and the opportunity for that. Yes.
Yeah,
What
it's
else?
beautiful, the aliveness. No, you were saying you were talking, saying in your talk that the ego is body identified, isn't it? Like the kind of core of the ego is body identification. And I think this is true. It's like this is sort of ground zero of ego is body identity. I am this. I'm in here. I own this. I'm the doer. all of this, and when this starts to dissipate and dissolve, this kind of common sense experience, actually starts falling apart, it can be very unsettling and disorienting. Make no mistake about it, right?
It can be passionate, too.
Oh.
Take me, just you do it. I'm done doing it.
That's not an element I
Two
was
different
thinking about.
styles.
But I'll take you up on that.
So I want to open it up for other people to join this passionate conversation.
Well, yes, it can be unsettling at first. But
Hello? Great discussion. I was wondering if one or more of you could comment on the topic of positive shadow, which I think many of us contend with in one form or the other. And I'll frame it with a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that when you're young, you idolized one or more spiritual teachers. That is, you projected the archetype of guru or mentor very strongly onto them. Over time, as you developed your own awareness, you began to withdraw that and develop that more access to that presence internally. And you can see them more as human beings that have their own pros and cons. Now for the twist. Let's say that you develop a personal relationship with one of these teachers and they approach you and say, hey, I hear you're a great psychotherapist in XYZ area. Could you help me out? And my question is, how might you respond given your history and you find that perhaps some of that old archetype is welling up, that shadow projection of, wow, this is my hero coming asking me for help. I'm curious how you might respond to that kind of scenario. Might you recuse yourself on the one hand? Might you succumb to sort of the ego inflation on the other hand? Or might you walk that path in between where you sort of surrender to the presence and allow that perhaps to help the person? I'm just curious to hear your reaction, and how do you contend with your own perhaps positive shadow is the summary of the question. You don't have to respond to the specific scenario if you don't want to, but it's how do you contend with your own positive shadow in these various relationships?
Did you even hear
it
the
sounded
question?
like a great question. I'm a little hard of hearing, and I actually didn't hear the whole thing. I heard hero, and what would you do?
What I heard in that is, you mentioned ego inflation, that to me, just hearing your example, that's the place that deserves the inquiry, because there's a reaction, there's a lifting up, and it feels personal to me, the way that you described it. So that, of course I'd need to know more, but that would be the place for inquiry from what I hear from what you're saying.
Let me summarize it. How might you counsel someone you admire?
Say that again slowly.
How might you counsel someone who you greatly admire yourself?
That's good. I imagine Francis Lucille coming to me for therapy. I would love it. I would get back to him.
Yeah, this is countertransference, isn't it? Exactly. So you want to work with that, so it doesn't
Well, I
get in
think
the way.
it could be. But you can admire somebody and not idealize them, I think.
That's true.
But even if you admire them, it's still countertransference.
It's worth taking a look.
And it's great. I mean,
But what if it isn't?
isn't what?
What if admiration is just that you
What if they're admirable?
like them? Yeah. What if they're admirable?
Sarah, there's another question. Thank you.
If you had Cheney as your
Who?
I'd
Cheney.
refer him.
Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney as
Oh,
your
Cheney.
client.
I don't know.
I do find my clients very admirable. Their courage, their vulnerability, their love of the truth touches me deeply, right? And inspires me, actually, to meet them and help them discover who they really are. So yeah, I have a lot of admiration, and it serves, it's the beauty of working with people who are open and interested in the truth, not just wanting to feel better, which most people are kind of at, but they want to know. They really want to know, what's the truth. And that's beautiful.
Sitting with just the question, I didn't actually hear the entire thing, but I'm getting the gist of it. My experience is I've actually had some people of fame come to me. When they walk in the room, they're a person like anybody else, and the more real I am, the more I just see them as a person. and meet them as that. And that's, I think, really what's needed. That's what they're asking for. They want to be there, they're asking for help, and that's what they're coming to you for. And so personally, I feel like to be authentic really means that you're inviting their authenticity to come into the room. And that also means that the roles fall away. I know what I'm there to do, so I have the role, but I don't feel I am that role. That's not what I am. What I am is what appears, and that responds to who comes in the door. So I think we can get caught up in the superficial facade of what someone is to the public. But that's most of the time not what they are within their psyche. There's a lot more mystery there and a lot more difficulty often, especially the more famous they are, the more difficult of a life they have to try to deal with that. So that's been my experience. I haven't met someone of that ilk that I've had trouble dealing with.
I'm a student at CIS. I'm in my first year of the clinical psychology program, so thank you for this panel because I feel like it's directly in the footsteps that I'm following. My question relates to, I basically find myself in the same situation over and over where a client can come with a problem, and I don't want to superimpose a worldview or a theory on, be like, hey, you're having this problem because you see the world this way. But if you change your perspective, the problem will disappear. And I find it very difficult to address problems with political matters or worldly events or depression or fears of death without going into non-dual theory. And actually, I was here last year, and I actually asked almost the same question last year, and I've been thinking about the answer for a year, which you gave. Specifically,
I didn't hear it.
What happened when you asked the question?
I asked the same question last year, and you basically spoke about just having open space for someone to come forward and explore that. And I thought about that for a year, and I'm grateful for that answer. But I really find myself stuck without bringing in words and concepts and theory, and I feel like I'm walking on eggshells in treatment because I don't want to superimpose a belief system on someone, but I also see that I can't really find another solution within their worldview.
Well, sometimes I don't think it's wrong to bring in another perspective, but I think it's also important that you're open to theirs. Part of what I think psychotherapists try to do, at least when I was one, is really to see what it's like to be in that person's dilemma and what they're grappling with. And to be able to have the kind of empathy that's needed to feel how are they struggling and what are they struggling with and what is it they see as the problem. You need to actually find out how they're looking at it to be able to bring in something that's going to be a point of view that's going to be able to open that up so they can have a bigger perspective and look into it. Also, I think trying to solve it is a difficulty. Sometimes things do need to get solved. And in that case, you have to bring in ways of problem solving and techniques for that. But if you have somebody who's just unhappy, then really meeting them where they are and helping them to see what they're struggling with and identify it is a step in the right direction. At least that's how I would move with it.
I would also encourage you to welcome the feeling that arises when you're with that client and feel it sounds, I remember that feeling as a beginner therapist where you feel like, oh, better. And just to tolerate, it's uncomfortable and you think, oh, I need to do something, I need to say something, I need to meet, but don't worry and maybe just give space to your own feeling and explore it in supervision and create space around your feeling, and that will deliver a direction. You don't need to come up with a solution effortfully. It's a kind of letting go. It's a little bit scary, but
it's an interesting question about reframing, right? Reframing, deframing, or nothing, right? And it depends on what we're talking about. Someone feels, if a client comes in and feels badly that nothing's being done about global warming, for instance, it's like, yeah, that's right. There's not much to say about that, is there? But they may have an interpretation around that where they feel exceptionally powerless, right? And then it would be interesting just to know what's the perspective, what's the worldview, right? And then always to ask the question, is it true? What's the truth? From your deepest knowing. This is what I do when I kind of distill core beliefs. It's like, bring your attention to the heart. What's your deepest knowing? There's no right answer. Don't think about it. It's really interesting what happens.
And questions are sometimes more powerful than trying to find a worldview that's going to crack them open. Like, it might seem obvious why something bothers somebody, but saying, what is it that bothers you about that, can open up a whole litany of story they've never told anybody. When they're crying about something and you get it, it's like, yeah, that would make anybody sad. Just saying, tell me more about what makes you sad about that, or what hurts you so much about that. And it gives them the chance to just unleash things they've never heard themselves articulate.
If this person is suffering, then there's some separation. They're identifying with a belief system or feelings or some way of being that's making them feel separate. So that's what needs to be unraveled to understand that. So it's not just offering another belief system, because what we're talking about here is not a belief system, it's the absolute truth about reality. So it's coming from that perspective to find those blind spots or those areas that aren't clear, and inquire and invite meeting of feelings and other experiences to unravel that, so that the realization of who they really are becomes possible.
Thank you so much.
I think we have time for another question.
It's way back.
Time is up. Can we do another question? We'll do one more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this panel. It's been very, very interesting. And I guess my question is around the tension between having boundaries in therapy, boundaries between the therapist and the client, and having those moments of non-dual connection. John, you had talked about having moments like that, and I know that for myself as a client that I've had moments with my therapist like that. And there's a lot of benefit to that, but when you come out of that, at least for myself, I have I wondered about that, and recognizing that having clear boundaries within the therapeutic relationship helps that to work. So, but yet in a non-dual state, there are no boundaries. That's the definition of it, is that it's complete interconnectedness.
So these are different levels of experience, and it's important not to confuse them. So the ordinary boundaries of the therapeutic relationship continue, right? Even as there's a recognition of the essential non-separateness. And that's true in therapy, and it's true in our ordinary life as well. They're just, it's a different domain of experience. And so Karen was saying, yes, the role continues, but you're not identified with the role, right? You function in that role. That's actually, there's something very functional that's happening in that role. But you don't need to take yourself as that. You're free of that, right? So we can experience our boundaried relative humanity, because individual organisms need boundaries to thrive. They're absolutely necessary. And we can simultaneously experience our essential non-separateness.
I kind of see it as those two categories being behavioral boundaries versus experiential boundaries. Behavioral boundaries is the appropriate action, and you don't need to have an actual sense of boundary there. It's your presence is responsive and sensitive and does what's appropriate in the situation. The non-duality can be present while you're being appropriately active. So I don't see those two things as necessarily limiting each other.
So I want to thank the panel. Thank you for that last word, Karen. This was fun, informative, and I hope helpful for everyone. So thank you so much.